Hey everybody, Brandon Vigliarola with the Register, and I'm here today with Marisol Cruz-Kane, Director of Information Technology and Cybersecurity at the U.S. Government Accountability Office, to talk about how 3 years on from President Biden signing his executive order on cybersecurity, implementation actually still hasn't been completed. Marisol, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Your team wrote this report, this latest Government Accountability Office report on the implementation status of the EO. I think it came out last week, and basically of the 55 kind of bullet points or requirements that need to be met, there were 6 that were outstanding. I think one of those was null and void, or was kind of being ignored, and the other 5 seemed like there were actual shortcomings in implementation. We can go into the individual items, but just before we do, like, is this, does this seem like, is this a serious issue, or is this kind of more like housekeeping things that still haven't been done yet?
Well, out of the 5 of them that are still partially done, I think they're all pretty critical. One of them has to do with creating a definition of critical software, and then defining what common categories of software that's used in the federal government would be part of that definition. So that is pretty critical. Agencies need to know what critical software they're using, and then what they're responsible for doing, not only in the procurement of that software, but also while they're using it, patching it, make sure that they're using the most recent versions of the software. So that's a pretty critical one. And from what CISA told us, they have a preliminary definition and also that preliminary list of what would be considered a critical software, but they're still refining it along with NIST and OMB. And they told us that they plan on getting that out in September of 2024. So that's positive, but until that gets out, you have software out there that agencies may not be securing as well as they should be, and also maybe software that agencies may not deem that as critical, but when this definition comes out, they may realize that it really is.
Right. So basically, to go through that list of 5 items, basically it's remove. So these are things that are all partially implemented. I think there was nothing that hadn't been at least started. In the report, right? Yeah. So there was removing barriers to threat information sharing, enhancing software supply chain security, establishing a cyber safety review board, improving detection of cybersecurity vulnerabilities and incidents, and improving the government's investigative and remediation capabilities. So yeah, those all seem pretty critical to me, right? I mean, now I know there is a cyber safety review board, like the CSRB was stood up, right? So that's been implemented.
Absolutely. They set that up.
But it's not complete, though.
Well,
right?
So they set the board up, and it does have members from the private sector and the federal government. They have a charter that outlines their responsibilities, and they have completed 3 large reviews, one of the SolarWinds incident, one of the Log4j, and one of the Lapsus incident. But what they haven't completed is the order tasked them to issue recommendations after that first Log4j review of how to improve the board's actual operations and how the board can do better. And they did issue those recommendations, but we couldn't find evidence that they were actually implementing those recommendations. So a few of the key recommendations are they wanted to codify in legislation the board itself and their authorities. They also made some recommendations for efficiency of the board's review procedures on how they perform their reviews and the time that it takes. And then another thing would be for CISA and DHS to look at those reports and I guess sort of disseminate them in a more efficient way. So those were the recommendations, some of the key ones that they made. And we just didn't find evidence that CISA or DHS was moving on them. And that review has been, out for about, I would say 6 months to a year now. So we really think it's important that the board functions efficiently because, when you have a large incident in the federal government, we need to know what was the timeline, what were the techniques, tactics, and procedures used, what were the
that seems like the whole point of that board, right?
Or the findings that can be shared amongst the federal government. So if that board's not operating the most effectively, then the reports are not going to be as good quality as they could be.
Right. Now I know OMB and DHS were both flagged as departments needing action, right? Because this report I think was about, or the executive order was about NIST, DHS, and OMB, and of course I think CISA falling under DHS. I'm assuming when we're looking at those 3.
Well, our report looked at what we called the leadership and oversight requirements. So the entire order contained 115 requirements, and that was for the entire federal agency. Our report just wanted to look at the foundational, what we called leadership and oversight requirements, which basically required those agencies, DHS, CISA, NIST, OMB, to do government-wide actions. So to issue guidance, to issue these critical pieces of information, and also to perform oversight and assistance to the agencies which had to do specific requirements within the EO. Like one of those cases was
Gotcha.
zero
Okay.
trust architecture. You know,
So this basically this report is basically, are the organizations leading this thing, leading it in a good, clear way?
I believe they are.
Is basically
I
kind of
believe
the
they did the majority of the things. Like I mentioned, the critical software is a very critical piece that is still not implemented. The board being able to operate at its ultimate effectiveness is really important. And the last three recommendations were to OMB. And those had to do with them coordinating with the different federal agencies who are responsible for other things in the executive order and working with them on resources. So performing cost analyses of threat sharing information, but also how much resources they need for things like CDM, EDR, and zero trust architecture. And what we didn't see was any evidence of ONB's conversations with the federal agencies to make sure that they had performed these cost analysis, or that they're making sure that not only OMB's budget, but the federal agencies are budgeting appropriately to take on these new capabilities that might be hard when they're using legacy systems and technology that might be outdated.
Yeah. It seems like part of good cybersecurity in this day and age is updated equipment, right? I can't tell you how often I write about, 4-year-old vulnerabilities, right, in this old piece of software, or even like, end of life devices that are being hijacked for botnets and stuff. It's pretty critical. So I guess, with implementation sort of being, mostly complete, but with some critical areas still left, outstanding, are there other, if these recommendations aren't resolved in a timely manner, are there other elements of the EO that maybe have already been taken care of or enacted that could be, threatened by these failures to meet these final few objectives?
Well, definitely with the critical software list, I think if the agencies are not understanding what critical software is to the federal government and they're not taking the appropriate steps to secure it, we can have another SolarWinds where bad actor takes advantage of a vulnerability in a software, and one that may have access to multiple platforms, multiple agencies that's used government-wide. So that is very critical. But also if OMB isn't really having productive conversations on resourcing and agencies don't have the appropriate budgets, then really none of this can get done. Zero trust architecture is huge, having an EDR capability and being able to log your events to even detect when a malicious actor is in your system. If you don't have the funds to do that, then we're just in the same place as before the federal or the executive order was issued. So these are some big things left over.
And just to clarify, critical software to you guys, does that mean just stuff running critical architecture or critical infrastructure? Or are we also talking about, office suites and software used for administration? Is that considered critical as well?
Yes.
Like Microsoft Office, Microsoft suites and stuff?
So they were tasked on creating what that list looks like. And I believe it'll contain everything that you just talked about, because even the suites and some of the software you run on your computer, if there are vulnerabilities and you're using a 10-year-old version that no longer patches or no longer provides updated security measures, that can be a real vulnerability and a pathway into your network and your systems that you don't need.
Right. Yeah. And even simple things like we've had a couple issues with Microsoft the past few years, having issues on their end that have led to executive branch stuff getting leaked or whatever, and it's all too easy with the amount of software. Right. So yeah, it's all got to be considered critical at some point. So do you have any idea, like, I know you mentioned a little bit before what it might take for some of these other agencies, but do you have any idea, are we on a timeline to get this implementation finished? Or are we still kind of looking at, it's going to be, what are we looking at?
So CISA has told us that in September, they would get out publicly the list of critical software. So that should be on a short time frame. They mentioned to us in December of this year, they would hopefully be finished implementing the recommendations on their cybersecurity review board recommendations. So hopefully next time they do a review, they can take those into consideration, and their review will be much, I don't want to say much more better, but it will be more efficient. And then OMB is having conversations with agencies on a regular basis about their resource needs. But what we'd like for them to do is document that and make that publicly available to the agencies and in their budget requests, so that the federal government has a real understanding of where the resources are, where they're needed, and what those conversations looked like.
Right. Now, I guess finally, the one thing I want to ask before we go here is, when I think about all this kind of stuff happening, and right, it's vital stuff, right? And it's unfortunate that it's taken this long to get these final few steps from leadership, right? These critical steps, get them finished up and fully implemented. One of the things I always worry about is, okay, say we have a new administration come in a few months, you know, is there, are you guys considering what to do if the executive order is either put on hold or if it gets nullified? Like all this time spent, if you were to just basically say, oh, stop it now, detach all the cables, pull out all the cords, right? Like, are we looking at being in a worse position, or have we at least managed to make some improvements that are likely to stick around past, an expiration of an EO or a new administration?
I think we've made some big strides here. You have a lot of moving to different technologies like ZTA and EDR and CDM that won't go anywhere if the executive order, is expired or someone comes in and puts different types of requirements in. It's all really about better securing the system. So hopefully if something does expire, a new administration does come in, we can still use what was taken from this executive order until there's new guidance out. And I think information security is a bipartisan issue. Everybody wants federal systems protected. They don't want large scale incidents to occur, or they'd like to prevent them. So any administration has shown that they've taken a large interest in cybersecurity. The national strategy came out earlier last year, which set up its 5 pillars for cyber, which has made a great roadmap for where we're going to go in the future. So if a new administration comes in and wants to update that, hopefully they will take on what was in place and just make some incremental improvements to that. But I think it's a bipartisan issue. Everybody knows that it's important. So I think what we're taking from each of these is going to be great and really foundational from what needs to happen in the future.
Well, that's great. That's good to know. It's nice to know that there's been some, there's been enough sort of solid core improvements that, even if, the brakes were put on today, there would still be lasting positive effects from that. So that's, it's good to know. I mean, I guess modernization really only goes in one direction, right? When it comes to this kind of these processes and these softwares and everything. So, well, Marisol, thanks so much for coming on and chatting about this with me today.
It was my pleasure.